paralyzed, if you like, from challenging racially essentialist notions. The second area where I think there needs to be some reflection on the social movement is the theorization of tactics and strategies. And here there's a really wonderful example in the book where they talk about the UCT curriculum strategy task team. And the book is not kind to the strategy task team. In fact, it says, it doesn't use this word, but it says that they're quite obnoxious in their tactics and strategies. But what it seems to me, there should be a reflection about that and how obnoxious behavior, obnoxious tactics can alienate the institutional community, as that book intimates. And I wonder whether that's something for the theorizations of tactics and strategies and social movements. The third is the role of leadership in enclaves. And the book articulates a number of strategies, it seems to me, on how to achieve positive outcomes around curriculum change. And it underscores the importance of leadership. And I want to just reflect a little on the WITS experience around engineering, which the book talks about. Now, what is interesting about the WITS engineering experience and curriculum change, it's both a combination of technical reforms on the one hand and fundamental curriculum shifts on the other, a core curriculum, for instance, which the book advocates for. And it's able to bridge the divide between those two. And I think that that is important when we're thinking about curriculum shifts, that it can't be seen simply as the big political, the big shifts, the big substantial. It must also enable better technical outcomes. And one of the things that did is create better opportunities for students to have multiple opportunities at learning. And part of that was because of the leadership in the faculty of the dean himself. But I do want to say again here, there was an interesting, I was quite struck by, the book does quote the VC, meaning me, and I was quite struck by the divisions that
Adam? Okay, we seem to have lost Adam. Someone says he seems to have lost us. Can we bring Adam back in? No.
It seems that Adam has dropped off the call, so it might be a problem on his side.
Okay. Maybe just keep him in the loop, and then once he comes back, he can finish off. I think it was on number 3 or 5. We can bring him back. In the meantime, I see Professor Blackie is on, so we can move forward. Professor Max Blackie is an associate professor at Rhodes University, Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning. Before that, she was a senior academic in the Department of Chemistry and Polymer Science here at Stellenbosch University. She holds a PhD in chemistry from UCT and has just completed a second PhD in the Faculty of Education at Stellenbosch University. We would also like, at this moment, as I hand over to her, want to congratulate Professor Blackie because she has just published a co-edited book titled Decolonizing Knowledge and Noah's Struggles for University Transformation in South Africa. Professor Blackie, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Precious, for that kind introduction. I presume that you can hear me. I see Professor Habib has just come back on. Should we let him finish?
We don't see him. Okay. Professor Habib.
Sorry, I don't know what happened.
You got cut off at 3 or 5, and we are quite eager for you to get to 4 and 5.
Okay, I promise you I'll finish it quickly. I don't know what happened. So I do want to say that, colleagues, the third one, I ended up by saying enclaves are important, but it's important to think through enclaves of radical curriculum and thicken them over periods of time so they become mainstreamed over a period of multiple years and multiple initiatives. So that's the third. The fourth really referred to the definition of decolonial, colleagues. The book looks at different definitional traditions, the technicist, the essentialist, the pedagogical, but I don't think it sufficiently thinks through another definition, which is outside the national lens. It's ironical given the fact that we talk about Pan-Africanism so much. And this is important because we live in a historical moment, colleagues, where all of our challenges are transnational in character: climate change, pandemics, inequality, social and political polarization. And what we need is universal solutions. By that, I don't mean Western solutions. We need an interaction between knowledge systems, and we need to have that interaction beyond racially essentialist notions of knowledge systems. And this requires of us a reimagination of universities and curriculum beyond national boundaries. It's something that we need to talk about far more than we have. And then finally, I want to end by saying, is it possible to decolonize in an unequal and neo-colonial world? There's an implicit tension in this book, and it's foregrounded by two examples. One is the Cuban medical program, and the second is the New School for Social Research. Now, the Cuban medical program, it reflects on how these medical students have been trained in Cuba, and off they come in the fourth or fifth year and then get retrained in a more curative direction in South Africa. Is that because of South African chauvinist agendas? Or is it because primary healthcare can only work if the rest of the environment is enabling of it? So if you go to Cuba, you will see that the entire social construct of the society is structured in a way that enables primary healthcare. When you come to South Africa, you're trained as a primary healthcare doctor, but the sanitation, the water, the entire environmental indicators don't enable it. So the retraining is very much a pragmatic outcome as opposed to something else. On the New School for Social Research, it's a fantastic institutional experiment in the 20s and 30s. But really, is it an exemplar of decolonization? It charges unequal fees for international students and domestic students. It exemplifies American higher education. It's a radical version of a national American canon, but it is still an American and Western canon. And I don't think it's an appropriate example. I think it poses an interesting question. Why were you able to do that in the United States, in the heart of what is the capitalist enterprise, by at least pushing the national boundaries of higher education? And yet, two new universities in democratic South Africa in the last 10 years never attempted to reimagine curriculum. What is it about the New School that was able to do it for all of the challenges of American society? And yet, this progressive government in South Africa, one whose ministry is led by a communist Nochai, and they didn't speak about radical curriculum at all. And what is it that forces us to fail in this regard, whereas much more innovative experiments have been tried elsewhere, even if they're not as decolonial as we think they are. So I'll stop there. I do say this is a wonderful book, and I do think it's a wonderful read, and we should take it much more seriously to inspire the debate to advance decolonization of the curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Blackie, I will hand over to you.
Great, thank you, Precious. So for the most part, I'm going to focus my comments on the level of the responses of academics. My choice is pragmatic. I am one of the case studies. Organic chemistry at Stellenbosch University is me. But much more importantly, I think that there's a fascinating portrait of academic freedom in this book. But before I get to that focus, I'd like to take a brief step back to say that I think that this book is one of the few books on decolonization which will outlast the current debate. It will do so because it is a meticulous description of responses on all levels of higher education to the pressures of the 2015-2016 protests, 2 to 3 years later when much of the research was carried out. and as such serves as a beautiful case study for the way in which this complex system of higher education in South Africa responds. The three positions of, firstly, the hastily drawn up institutional documents, secondly, the dissonance between the CHE, SAQA, DHET, and the accreditation bodies of professional degrees, and thirdly, the wholehearted, well-intentioned responses of individual academics are discussed in the book. And account is given for the fact that 3 years after much of the research was conducted, very little has actually changed on the ground. When I read the accounts of the academics, all of whom are trying to respond in their own context in particular ways, my heart is warmed. Each is well-intentioned, creative, and works well within their spheres to leverage change. Some are thwarted before they have had an impact, maybe because they were deemed too radical. And one or two have real agency because they already occupied positions of authority and can coerce alignment. I cannot help but think of Margaret Archer and her notions of structure and agency. I am at the point of my career tipping from being an individual academic, doing my thing in my department, to being someone who necessarily needs to understand the bigger picture. I think before reading this book, I had a notion of academic agency that believed in the power of the individual to affect change. If we can just create the right argument, which equates, obviously, to that right beautiful paper, or perhaps with Adam Habib and Jonathan Janssen in the room, who are adept at op-eds, we can extend that to a succinct public argument. If we can just create that argument, we will be able to get others to follow. As a lecturer, I confess I did not factor in the level of CHE, SAQA, DHET, and I don't feel particularly bad about that. Teaching chemistry, my fight was never really going to be at that level. There is a world of bureaucratic machinations that are designed, intentionally or not, to slow change. At a national level, the structure's purpose is to sustain the existing structure. At an institutional level, what happened with the 2015-16 protests, it appears, is that survival kicked in. And Professor Habib has already alluded to this. Documents were produced to mollify the protesters whilst keeping the ship afloat. The responses are pragmatic and situational. And in the words of Innocent Pikirai, who is an archaeologist at the University of Pretoria and one of the case studies, he says, it was a reaction to the political circumstances to say, how best should we be seen to respond, rather than to say, how should we respond robustly to the challenge since we've been caught napping? Once a policy document was drawn up, it appears that it was left very much to individual academics to enact. 2 chapters in the book are devoted to the stories of academics. One focuses on arts and social sciences, and the other on STEM fields. It's fascinating to me that across the board, the authors trace the orientation and inclination to engage meaningfully in decolonization efforts to life events which were in place well before the protests. And indeed, most of the academics were already enacting some of the changes which are now labeled as decolonization prior to the 2015-2016 protests. The main difference between the two groups of academics is their orientation to the work of decolonization. For the social scientists, the authors remark, each had had an intellectual journey which had transformed their own thinking about the politics of knowledge. For the STEM academics, of whom I am one, the authors note that the respondents share a sensitivity, patience, and understanding. The strategy taken is one of intellectual persuasion rather than political confrontation. And my own work is used to exemplify this. Along with my colleague, Hanli Ardendorf, we work to use legitimation code theory, which quite usefully incorporates a Cartesian plane as part of the methodology to mediate the conversation. And I'll say unequivocally that the presence of that Cartesian plane lowers the threshold to engagement to social science theory for STEM academics. Our goal was to mediate a space between the knee-jerk science response that science is science is science, or an atom is an atom is an atom, led largely by this thought that science is objective, and the very real experience of alienation expressed by the students. Legitimation code theory gave us a way to explain to scientists why the personal experience of the students might be worth paying attention to. Ultimately, as is noted in the book, in chemistry in particular, which is a science born at the height of the colonial era, the curriculum won't change much, but how we teach and what examples we use matters. And as far as I am concerned, the major invitation is to bring into focus the community of chemists. We don't actually hold the knowledge of science as an individual. It is held by the community and agreed upon by the community. I draw very much on the work of Bernard Lonergan and his breakdown of experience, insight, judgment, and decision-making to show that only the moment of insight is in fact individual. The other three components of understanding or knowledge building include the community in some way. In reading the case studies, the element which is mentioned frequently is assessment. The notion of testing this individual's capacity to recall information in a closed book timed exam is inextricably, in my mind, linked with Western individualism. It's curious to me to observe that of the hundreds, if not thousands of papers that have been written on decolonization across South Africa, that only a handful to date deal with assessment in any kind of meaningful way. As long as our assessment practices remain unchanged, it doesn't matter what we teach in the curriculum. We have not yet begun to scratch the surface of decolonization. I argue in a book chapter that has just been published, that was the book that Precious mentioned in the introduction, that it is the continued unquestioned position of the individual as the locus of knowledge, which is the toxic Western construct which we need to overcome. I am not asking for a return to the notion of community as it was pre-individuation, but rather to ask what community post-individuation looks like. As I've already said, knowledge is always held in community, not in the individual. The individual must know how to connect to the knowledge field of the community, and that is what it means to be educated. But as long as our assessments continue to focus on what this person can spew out of their mind in a closed session on one given day, I think we are failing. It is my contention that our assessments are not fit for purpose. This book should be recommended reading for incoming academics because it is a case study in power. Returning to Archer's nexus of structure and agency, what strikes me is that the policy documents of the university look like they provide the structure which will enable the agency of individual academics. And indeed, in my own experience, it did give me license to explore intellectual spaces which would have been deemed detrimental to my career had the policy not been in place. And so individual agency was given, but it was not met by the structural will to change. The structure remained and remains self-preserving. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Blackie. We will shift the focus. We've just jotted down a few major points that were raised there, and we'll come back to it once we get into the conversation part of our launch today. I'm going to shift the focus to the speakers that we have in-house, starting with Professor Liz Lange. Liz is a professor in higher education at CHED. She joined UCT from the University of the Free State. She has served as Executive Director and Acting CEO for the Higher Education Quality Committee in the Council on Higher Education, which is CHE. For most of us who are within the university, we all know what the CHE is. Actually, you should be working on your reviews right now. Liz's research interests focus on philosophy and politics of education. She has done research on change in higher education, as well as on the meanings and possibilities of the notion of transformation, especially at a curricular level. Her current work is on higher education curriculum and pedagogy in the context of the call for decolonization of the curriculum. She is the author of White, Poor, and Angry, White Working Class Families in Johannesburg. and also a co-editor with Professor Leonard Prague of #Mass for Understanding the Moment. Colleagues, friends, and families, we welcome Professor Lange.
Is that okay? Okay. To start with, I do not know, Adam didn't say it, but I mean, it took me some time not to be defensive as I was reading the book, because I was in an executive position at 2 universities as all of this was unfolding. And moreover, the organizations at national level that are responsible for quality assurance, etc., were also in my name. So I felt slightly guilty as I was reading the book. But that aside, I think that the book is really an important book, and I think that you all agree with that. I think that what the book does is what nobody else has done so far, and it is to trace empirically something that happened. So far, we have all talked a lot about what we thought about it, reasoned about it, etc. But nobody has actually sat and look at the manner in which these things unfold at the institution. I think that that's very, very important. So I decided to focus on 3 areas, which I think are particularly important. But I do believe that the book makes importantly and wide-ranging points about politics, about management of change, and about activism. Okay, the first point that I would like to talk about is the institutional model. So the main thesis that you demonstrate is that whatever the impetus of change, it was in the end diluted. In some places more than others, but diluted in the end. So I think that the range of responses that you show are telling us that actually we did not know what we were doing, and in that sense, I tend to agree with Adam. No executive team in the country had a notion of what decolonization was. None of us were sufficiently familiar with the debates, the literature, or actually made the effort during that period to have a position. So decolonization emerged as part of a set of demands that were put to the executives of universities and the circumstances of violent protest. In that context, probably we were more preoccupied about insourcing than about the decolonization of the curriculum, because we could put a figure to the one, and we did not know what the other was going to cost. And that does not mean that it is a compliment to the management. It's simply a description of the circumstances under which we operated. So we did not have a theory of change as to how the decolonization of the curriculum could unfold at institutions. I think that if we had, and if we have thought that that was a good idea, then the decolonization of the curriculum would have been something that all management teams or institutions would have been sort of aligned with at the time. And I think that this is something that we as executives and as leaders in higher education should recognize. At the University of Cape Town, I arrived post factum to the executive. But I found very interesting that what we did there was to push the discussion of the curriculum completely outside of the normal governing system of the university, create a parallel university where these things were possible, while at the real university, with inverted commas, this was not happening. So there were different creative solutions in relation to this, but I do not believe that we went out to stop the change. I don't think that we understood it sufficiently, and we were certainly not being able to enable it either, in that sense. Now, what I find very interesting is that if you look at this problem from the other side, from the point of view of the activists that were proposing this, the people who were populating these task teams and etc., there was a translational problem there too. But then, because it was very, very difficult to find the language of communication between those who were proposing changes and those who were listening, some sympathetically, some with great panic, at what this meant. It was an impossibility of conversation. They were talking languages that were incompatible. Not only that the languages were abstruse, which in some cases there were. So I think that this is a very interesting thing that I think it is worth exploring. I think that the notion that the decolonization failed at the point of the operationalization is an interesting point, and the reality of that is that the HODs, the individual academics, etc., those were the builders of the possibilities, but those were self-interpreted in a sense. They didn't get a direction from the university as to what was possible. So it's a self-initiated thing that Max was talking about. I do believe, having lived with you, Jonathan, through the experience of the enclave of the curriculum at the university, that those things are interesting and there are more possible. But still, I do not believe that the enclave curriculum, even if it comes from the office of the Vice Chancellor, actually makes a dent into the institutional. And I think that the UFS 101 and the ground program are examples of that does not permeate into the rest of the curriculum. It's wonderful, and maybe one thinks that that's a particular theory of change accompanying this. I will sort of leave out some I think that there is a conception of the curriculum amongst the proponents of decolonization that does not actually understand curriculum and does not understand the technicalities of curriculum and the things that accompany curriculum change, that go from the sublime to the ridiculous and back to the ridiculous, which are the timetable, the manner in which the calendar is organized, what happens in the classroom. You know, there are stupid things, but those are the things that limit or enable other stuff. And I think that this is something that was never understood. The cost, what are the things that need to change in order to enable the curriculum to change. The second point that I would like to make is about the regulatory environment. And I just want to make one sort of public sort of acknowledgement or confession. None of the agencies, certainly the CHE, was created to control. We were created to steer in a transformational direction. And I think that we made a number of mistakes. And the first mistake was political and was conceptual. And it was to think that tools that have been designed for control under a new public management type regime were going to help change anything. And I think that we were wrong in that. And the last point that I want to make is about the issue of the politics of the spectrum. I think that, I don't necessarily agree with your interpretation of the politics of the spectacle, neither I'm totally in alignment with Helen Strauss. I think that one of the things that we need to ask ourselves is why is it that there were so many selfies of individual protesters put up in the social media during that period? And what does it tell us? That the need of documenting was not documenting the revolutionary moment, but was documenting the fact that I was there. And I think that this has something to say about the particular characteristics of our culture and the psychology of our students. And I think that we need to start investigating that. And I stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Lange, because I can see that you were giving me a very good eye. I don't know if that was engagement or acknowledgement of the power that is recently been endowed. I've been endowed with here. Whatever it is, it was. Thank you. Our last respondent is Professor Wakbi Long. Professor Long is a clinical psychologist in the Department of Psychology at UCT and the director of the Child Guidance Clinic. He is also the deputy dean in the Faculty of Humanities, also at the University of Cape Town. He's widely published in history, theory, and indigenization of psychology. Wakbi has held research fellowships at Harvard and Durham. And his latest book, of which I was watching a video of you on SABC, Nation on the Couch, Inside South Africa.
Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much, Jonathan and Cyril, for inviting me to this launch of what is more than a book, but I think a timely and vital intervention. My brief tonight is to offer a more personal account of my own journey through this call for decolonization in the Department of Psychology at UCT, and then also to offer some related reflections about Jonathan and Cyril's book. So 20 minutes is just not enough time, so I won't even bother with pleasantries. Let's just get right in. There are two memories that stand out for me during those tumultuous years of 2015 and 2016, and they both happened within the space of 1 week. The first happened when I was delivering an undergraduate lecture, third year clinical psychology on Upper Campus. The lecture was disrupted in 2016, and I thought, if memory serves, that I'm going to try and proceed with this lecture, nonetheless, on the grounds that I was going to be talking about the problem of access of mental health services. More pointedly, the lack of access to mental health services in South Africa. Needless to say, that intervention didn't go down very well, and the lecture did end. That was my first memory. The second was a few days later when I was at a departmental open meeting, and one of the students who was present said that he believed that neuropsychology should not be taught at UCT because it did not resonate with his lived experience. Of course, I was troubled by this because I thought to myself, but what about all the children from poor and working class communities that rely on the services, the assessments of our neuropsychology students? So those were the two really standout moments for me, and they troubled me because it made me wonder about the outlook, the breadth of the vision of the decolonization moment. And it seemed to me as if there was very little room for maneuver and debate. Be that as it may, by 2017, I had set up a critical theory course in our Masters for Clinical Psychology program, and I centered this course around Fanon's idea of sociogeny, the idea that a sick society that has a socially patterned defect, to use Erich Fromm's term, creates enormous psychological distress in the lives of individual people. And I incorporated the thoughts of some intellectual lodestars like Fanon, Biko, Kohler, Crenshaw, Spivak, and others. Now, of course, my setting up this module was to some extent a response to the student protests, but it also reflected a much longer struggle of my own since the early 2000s to feel at home in this discipline of psychology generally, but clinical psychology more specifically. I happened to train in clinical psychology here at Stellenbosch in the early 2000s. And by the time I finished my community service in early 2005, I felt completely alienated from the discipline to the point that I deregistered from the Health Professions Council and bought myself a ticket to the Sahara Desert. I eventually returned to UCT in 2010, and I found that the students were grappling with the same difficulty. The curriculum left them cold. They felt alienated from its contents, and they were exercised by this problem that is known within psychology as the problem of relevance, constellated around issues of curriculum, access, and demographics. I saw an opportunity, so I did my PhD on this relevance problem. And I discovered two things. Number one, it was an international issue in the discipline of psychology. No matter where you traveled and no matter how far back you went into the history of psychology, there was this problem of relevance in this discipline that appeared not to travel very well. It went under different monikers over the decades. A crisis, a relevance problem, a need for indigenization, and latterly, a call for decolonization. In short, the status of psychological knowledge and of the discipline itself has been questioned for a very long time. It didn't start in 2015. The second thing I realized was that in the history of South African psychology, everybody claimed to be doing relevant psychology. Whether it was Afrikaner nationalists in the 60s, anti-apartheid activists in the 70s and 80s, or market-friendly liberals in the post-apartheid years, everybody was doing relevant psychology. The point is, and this was the second thing I discovered as I got into this problem of relevance, is that it was impossible to fix its meaning, what a relevant psychology is. And this, I think, is where I'd like to segue into Cyril and Jonathan's book. Number one, their argument that decolonization, the term, has no fixed meaning. That's a very important observation. And I want to tie it to what Ernesto Laclau calls empty signifiers. Now, empty signifiers are incredibly important to populist causes because they allow one to symbolize the political terrain in powerful ways. On the one hand, you get a situation similar to what Victor Hugo describes, where he writes, an invasion of armies can be resisted, but not an idea whose time has come. Empty signifiers are enormously popular, enormously powerful. But on the flip side, as Jonathan and Cyril argue, the indeterminacy of the meaning of decolonization meant that it could mean all things to all comers. And so therefore, it could easily be, quote unquote, defanged. And as such, decolonization could be sapped of its radical potential. That's the first point that really struck me about this book. The second point is that institutions can outlast ideas. And Cyril and Jonathan come up with a veritable armamentarium of strategies that accomplish that when it comes to how institutions deal with intruder ideas. Posturing, diluting, bureaucratizing, disciplining, regulating, marginalizing, and domesticating radical ideas. In short, institutions can defang such ideas like decolonization precisely because they accommodate those ideas. This got me thinking about Herbert Marcuse's idea of repressive tolerance. And a contemporary reading of that idea of repressive tolerance is where you have an institution of power that deals with an undesirable idea by specifically admitting it to the high table in order to neutralize it. This brings me to my third and final observation about this book, which is regarding the critical importance of institutional theory and institutional analysis. Focusing on curriculum issues won't cut it, for as long as the institutional curriculum remains settled. And by institutional curriculum, I mean the rules which govern what counts as knowledge. Let me conclude with Cyril and Jonathan's words on the final page of their book. Decolonization of the curriculum did not fail to be taken up in institutions because it was too radical. The problem was that it was not radical enough. And this brings me back to the very early question that Adam raised. How do you decolonize in an unequal society? And I think we have to keep in mind that it's a very long walk from the gown to the town. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Now I want to move here from the authors themselves. Allow me just a few minutes to introduce who they are. I know here we are mostly okay, I hope everybody can hear me now. I was going to say, a lot of us here are colleagues, friends, and family, and we know the authors in various capacities. But for formality's sake, and also because I have this power, I'm going to introduce them. Professor Jonathan Jansen is a distinguished professor of education at Stellenbosch University and the president of the Academy of Science of South Africa. He is a curriculum theorist, and his research is concerned with the politics of knowledge. Recent publications include Fault Lines, a primer on race, science, and society, and in our own words, Nurses on the Front Line. Professor Jansen has, as of August 19th, won the award for research excellence from the DVC of Research, Innovation, and Technology at Stellenbosch University. And Dr. Walters, Cyril Walters, is a research fellow in higher education studies at Stellenbosch University. She also teaches here in the MBA program at the business school. Dr. Walters is the co-editor of Fault Lines, a primer on race, science, and society. She is currently engaged in projects examining the intersection of race, gender, in higher education, as well as complexity theories in leadership. Colleagues, friends, family, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Walters and then Professor Jansen, and they will give us their sentiments about the book.
Thank you, Precious. I just want to say I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really honored for our respondents who have agreed to help us. This is my first co-authored book. The previous book was edited, and so it's a big deal for me. And my My fellow co-author launched a book last week, so he's used to this, and I don't think he invited a crowd like me. He probably has another book next week. But, this is my moment, so I just have to do this. I just want to thank my mom and my dad. There I go. I hope I've made you proud. So, but the program was night, and we were told we have 5 minutes to reflect. And so I realized, and when I saw Bobby earlier, he said, "You interviewed me 4 years ago." And this has been a long project, and a lot has happened since then. But, you know, for those of you, let me just give a quick timeline. We started our data collection. It was sort of my first work post-PhD, and I had a baptism of fire into collecting data across the country. And in 2017, it was long before the words team and Zoom were part of the lexicon, which is unknown. And so we went around to universities and 2 campuses and met with people, and that was an experience to, as Liz referred to, get empirical work. That was the difference. We knew we were onto something because there was a lot written, there was a lot said, but we wanted to find out and report on what actually was going on. And so we had gone to these 10 universities, interviewed over 200 people, and so we finished up the data collection 2.5 years later, and a pandemic comes, and so all of a sudden, we realized, even just as we had to interact with colleagues, and that it was all about going to the digital environment, and so we actually sensed how the easing for decolonization presented itself, because we had this global, this disrupting event. But we then wrote the book in 2020, and that was the last time we were in touch with it. So thank you to Cambridge for launching it in 2022. But we felt the political pressure had subsided. If I remember personally, 2015, 2016, my first memory is the Jamie shuttles being blocked and the burning of tires, getting onto campus, staff couldn't get up. I remember colleagues being held to ransom, being locked in buildings, being told what to do. Those memories one doesn't forget. But the one thing that, as I reflect and as I thought yesterday, I tried to, ask myself, why were the responses so different? And, when you go into these institutions, it really stares you in the face how different each institution is, in terms of its political history, in terms of the political cultures, what they want to do, and that stares you in the face, and it really speaks to the different ways in terms of how institutions responded. It became obvious it actually wasn't part initially to go to regulatory bodies and look at the apparatus of how they're doing, but what we found is that when we went to institutions, they always used it as a weapon, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, to say, well, we've got accreditation and we've got this and we've got that, so you need to speak to them. So for me, I needed to get around the regulatory apparatus, and the one thing that was very obvious is that they were not set up for swift decision making. And so we did see the effect there. And so we also realized that, after 2018, decolonization then moved into a compliance affair. And so that was very interesting when we did the legwork in terms of looking at the tick boxes that had to do it. But essentially, academics on the ground had to operationalize it. It's all the people that were responsible. And what we saw was that decolonization basically aligned with the personal identities and their professional needs. And that's essentially what happened on the individual level. I do take your point, Liz, about looking at the other side and the students came. And I think that's very important and that should be spoken about. But essentially, we didn't interview students because it was the responsibility of the academics to actually implement whatever decolonization was. In a way, we did see some students, because many students that were part of the protest became, in some universities, part of the academic staff. But they were very far and few between. But I thought I just maybe want to end off and bring it back to the business school. I'm in the fortunate position that I have a hybrid appointment between the educational faculty and Stellenbosch Business School. And as was the point made by Wabi, decolonization, it's not a Stellenbosch problem, it's not a South African problem, it's a global problem in terms of curriculum, in terms of managerialism, in terms of the management sciences. How do we make it relevant? What are we doing? What are the narratives that our students are hearing? And so I wanted to just ask the question, is it actually possible to decolonize a business school curriculum? How do we start? Where do we start in terms of the management sciences? It's complex, it's difficult. Some might say it's even impossible. The language I've often heard when we talk in meetings and when you look at literature, it's about doing things for the greater good of society. It's about business and society. It's about transformation. It's about diversity, equity, inclusion. All these beautiful words, and that's what I hear. I don't hear decolonization. So I was interested that we didn't actually have a site for a business school. So I thought, seeing me here, I also realized that the press wasn't here. The pressure wasn't there. It's graduate students in most business schools. They are part-time, and so this issue was not a problem. But I thought that a good way in terms of, and I have the benefit of being an alum of a business school and teaching at a business school, is that we really engage with the political economy of capitalism, because we know colonialism is so intricately linked to capitalism. And so if we can at least talk about issues of colonialism and get the conversation going to how it actually affects the issues now of inequality in those issues that we want businesses to fix. I know, there's that very popular picture that made the Time magazine where you have the Johannesburg suburb, and we use that picture to show inequality from an aerial point of view. But how do we explain it from the past? Slavery, the indignation of slavery, of heritage, of racism, of power. These words, I know some of our students come here that never, ever heard about it. And so, as much as we've got our accreditations and our curriculum and these 12 things that we need to get through, that we contextualize it and not be prescriptive, but just broaden the critical lens in which we look at the management sciences and where we are and how we fix things. So that's my reflections on the book. Thank you all for being here.
Once again, thank you as well from my side for all of you being here. Thank you for our amazing respondents, Adam, Ants, Liz, and Bobby. Thank you, Precious, for steering us with this newfound power. I just wanted to so done a few co-authored books in my life, and so this is the first one with Cyril. And I do want to do a shout out to her because I don't know anybody who I've worked with before who has worked so hard to, on the political side of things, first of all, going across the country, back and forth, sometimes 2-3 times to UJ, to make sure that we get the story straight. And so, huge admiration for you, for your unbelievable energy and commitment to the task. Yes, indeed. Cyril was remiss in one respect, though. She is correct to thank her parents. But every time we were out, I remember one day being out in Makanda, in the old Grahamstown, and we were doing, I don't know how many interviews that day, and then suddenly it happened again, as it always happened. Listen, I got to get back for Levi. Could you give a shout out to Levi for giving us his thank you, Levi, for allowing your mother to get into all the field work. He's the handsome dude there that I hope will one day marry my granddaughter. That's another story. And so on. So you know, just going back, when this thing decolonization happened, I was immediately miserable in the intellectual sense. Because I said, this doesn't make any sense. Why is this coming up in South Africa now? We have never used this word in all in the 1980s struggle, in the 1960s. Decolonization wasn't a South African word, it's a Zimbabwean word for sure. It was a word in Botswana, it was a word, but South Africans didn't use decolonization in part because whites were regarded as citizens. You know, as Mahmoud Mandani correctly says, this is the country which, both in the Freedom Charter, which and in the Constitution, didn't regard whites as settlers. We regarded South Africans as citizens as a conscious decision. One of the few good things the ANC did in its history, right? And so why are students using this word decolonization completely out of place? And I knew there was something wrong. I got a lot of heat for saying that in different forums. Not because decolonization is not an important political project, that I buy into, but it was used in a very loose, haphazard, irresponsible way to mean everything under the sun. And so even today I saw a cover of article, decolonizing journalism, decolonizing the oceans, I said, that's okay, but it's a lazy thing. It's the way we evangelicals talk, you know, every soul must be saved in a particular way, you know, we're going straight to hell. There's just no sense of thought behind what the words mean. And so that is why we did the deep dive into Untitled Chapter. I think Adam, Wally, Max, thank you so much for your comments. It was incredibly rich. There's some things definitely someone I will think about. I think you guys are arms on the first issue. I think what both Liz and Adam do is they begin to reflect on themselves as individuals and whether or not they were, posturing. And they were the good guys. Okay. We were not talking about them. We were giving Adam's a political scientist. We weren't talking about this from the position of political science. We were talking about this from the position of the sociology of institutions, which means that the institution is more than a collection of individuals. The institution is also, rules, regulations, policies, arrangements, and people know now the system. In fact, as a former dean and vice chancellor and head of department, I can tell you right now, as I'm sure Liz will confirm, deputy vice chancellor and vice chancellor have much less power than what a dean and HME will do, talk employment equity, and you know what I mean. That's where you don't see the chemistry department making a decision on a lecturer. University of 117 departments, you can't control everything, nor should you. And so the institutional analysis of curriculum is not out of this. The institutional curriculum is all those arrangements that are in place. And that is why when these documents are handed over to the Senate, everything stopped dead in its tracks. Why? Because academics were going to implement it, no matter what you thought about it, And some institutions were, of course, more ridiculous than others. UJ was, for us, the funniest institution, because they literally went over the weekend from decolonization, new vice chancellor, fourth industrial revolution. It's a spectacular for everybody. And so the performance management things went from, did you decolonize your curriculum this week? To, now I'm not even making this up, this is not a caricature, this is what actually happened, to a new performance management thing. Did you 4IR your curriculum this month? It was so ridiculous that it took completely the sting out of what was potentially a really thing. Along the way, we had fascinating experiences. The UCT academics who didn't want to talk to us. Now, most people don't like me in universities, but they'll talk to me anyway. Except at UCT, because and it was very clear to us that it had everything to do with the fact that we thought for ourselves. What decolonization did was to force people politically to think like everybody else. What they didn't realize, when you make that kind of demand in universities, you are no longer a university. Because the university is a place in which you allow people with outrageous ideas to think for themselves. And so I found that really fascinating. Nelson Mandela University was fascinating. I've never seen a university produce so much policy documents on decolonization, which was all complete nonsense. But they built up this huge vocabulary of stuff that if you were a dean of engineering, you would say, what the fuck? I mean, you can just see this is not making any sense. That was another fascinating thing to me. And the other fascinating thing, and so what he calls interviewing Adam in his home. And if you ever tried to interview Adam, he's a moving target. He can't sit down. I mean, he loves the way he speaks. Adam moves all the time. And then literally having to follow Adam and try to get a sense of, Adam would open his sort of side, the people leading decolonization would be actually, just want these things in common and criteria and compliance and so on and so forth, whereas it has a broad idea. So that level of honesty. And then I suppose something I'll never forget, I won't mention the university because it interrupted me. And so I often ask them, what how was this happening? I never forget being lectured by an engineer, a civil engineer, about what decolonial, the way decolonial actually means. I felt that I should be reciprocated during my lecture on fluid dynamics, but I didn't. It was incredible arrogance, but that could only happen at that university, etc. So it was fascinating. Thank you so much for being. And also, I just have to say this, that if you ever want to work with somebody who can manage 200 interviews with such precision, that she will say, no, we are not seeing, without looking at anything, she said, we've seen this professor in the medical school at Wits on the 13th of August at 14:30. I said, how the hell do you know that? She has an unbelievable brain, as a family will tell you. And this project would have been mismanaged from a data point of view, from the code, but intellectually, she's also the only person I know besides Downey Fisher, perhaps, with whom I'm working on a book, who will actually tell me I'm talking crap. Even Downey wouldn't do that, even as we were. So thank you so much for the honesty, for the hard work, and for the book. I'll be very happy with the next book to make a Walters and Johnson, because I honestly think you get far better credit for the stuff that we produce together. Anyway, this book is dedicated to DeMac. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful note to end it on. And Lieber is a wonderful young gentleman. We want to move on to the conversation part of our program today. We have quite a big crowd here. And as you can see on that screen, we also have quite a big crowd online and across the world. So what I will do is we'll take 3 questions at a time. Okay. So I'll take 3 questions in-house and allow our authors and the respondents to respond to it. I can see Adam is still with us. I'm sure Max is still with us. And then you can all take, if you want to respond to it, you can have a go at responding. And then I'll take another round of questions from our online community, and then we'll come back and check on our time. Is that fine? And then just one word of advice. Make your question as succinct as possible. Try not to give context, okay, as much as you can. Go to the question. This will allow the respondents to be better able to articulate or respond to it. Because if you get into the context, you might get lost in the context. Okay? So I will take any questions here by show of hands. I have my own questions, but I think that would be just too much gross manipulation of power.
For it.
I have quite a couple actually, but that would be a gross manipulation of power. Okay, if you're still getting organized, I will ask the team online. Do we have questions there? Or okay, so we have a question from Coglian Govender. Would you want to unmute yourself or type your question?
Yeah, just read the question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Who should be creating spaces for society to unpack individual and collective thinking models around decolonization?
Okay, who should be creating that space? So there's a question, who should be creating space for institutions and individuals to unpack what decolonization should be? Yeah. Okay, maybe as people are still sorting their questions, can I throw in the questions that I have? Thank you very much. I think that last statement, which is literally the last sentence in the book, it sat with me to say, what do you mean an idea is not radical enough? Okay. What do you mean an idea is not radical enough? That's my first question. My second question was when you talk about the institutions that are affiliated with the university that we know, SAPA, DHED, and the various roles that they play in establishing what you've called the settled curriculum. How much of that is involved in designing the actual curriculum, or is it just individual will? Because at the end of the day, people run institutions. It's not a machine, it's people, and it's people that we know by name. At the end of the day, we can say so and so in that office. So how much at the end of the day comes down to willingness to make the changes vis-a-vis the bureaucratic constraints that are there? That'll give us three questions there. And I'm posing this question to Mags, Adam, and to all of us here, the respondents that are in-house.
Can give a sketching of that. This one. Okay, so I think the word radical, the way we use it in the last page, refers to in the etymological sense to roots, going back to the roots. So at the root of an institution, you haven't really addressed the sedimentation, the stuff that keeps things in place. You with me? You were addressing it at a rhetorical level, at the what the institution was doing or not doing. If you think of the decolonization demands, for example, we went through all the demands, page by page. But that actually doesn't solve anything. Conditions and the condition uproot, radical as in uproot, the foundations of knowledge in institutions. So, for example, ask yourself, how is it possible that Stellenbosch, in this day and age, that somebody could possibly write anything about colored women's hygiene and intelligence? You see, that is not resolved at the level of a political speech. That is resolved at the level of uprooting the knowledges in Stellenbosch, roots and papers in anatomy and in genetics, that still speak about people in terms of racial essences. That's the point. We didn't uproot those deep understandings of what it means to know and who knows and who doesn't know and so on and so forth. That's the radical You were talking about we should be creating spaces. Yeah.
I think that there is another way of interpreting that. Certainly, this is my own thing, and it is that decolonization missed the political point of a structural critique of the society. It got stuck at the level of the protest. It got stuck in the emotional part of it, in the identity politics of it. It didn't manage to get to a deep critique of the capitalist society, why we have the kind of structure that we have. You cannot have a decolonized university as an island in a decolonized, in a non-decolonized society, so to speak. Using for decolonization in a very sort of a broad kind of sense. So in an unjust society, it seems impossible to have a just university. So why is it that we think that in this little space, we can have a decolonized curriculum with the whole world around us is still a very problematic space of injustice. So I think that that's something that it is worth thinking
I can only endorse that view. I think that the terms of reference need to be broadened. There's a chasm between the tower and the street, and if the terms of reference for decolonization apply only to matters of curriculum and how universities are run, without looking at the kind of society that supports those universities, then I don't think, to use that word again, we're being radical enough.
And sorry a quick critique. Are we not then, again, shifting the marker? Because we're saying, here's a radical idea that was presented to the university, an idea that has always been there, but is incarnating in different ways. And then you come to departments shift the issue to faculties shift the issue to Senate shifts it back to whoever, they shift it to these auxiliary organizations, and then we come back to the university and then they say, no, we are only a reflection of society. Are we not again shifting the marker to say it's not radical enough because society is not radical enough? Are we not shifting the mark of responsibility away from ourselves? So how much of that is individual willingness and how much of that is something else?
Yeah.
I see Adam wants to, Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, so colleagues, I want to come back to this debate because I think it's an interesting one and I think it's a broader one. On the one hand, Jonathan started off by making a reflection that we have to understand that the institution, that what the book is talking about is the institution, less the individual vice chancellor, less Liz Lange. We need to understand it's the collective set of rules, regulations, individuals, processes that we're bureaucratic and we're defanging the movement. Jonathan, my response to that is you're absolutely right. I'm not taking this personally. I'm just saying, I think the entire institution is far less cohesive than we imagine. What effectively, there is a defanging, but the defanging is not part of a proactive agenda where even the heads of departments are coming together and saying, this radical group of activists want to decolonize, let's see how we figure out how to unravel them. Yeah. It actually is the reproduction, if you like, of processes, institutional rules, that by their very nature, because they just act and perform in that context, they act in a defanging. Universities, by their very nature, are conservative institutions like all big institutions. And so in a sense, It is not a malevolent individual, Precious, that play. It's not somebody figuring out how we're going to undermine this. There's no coherent political science head of department thinking, now I want to advance a radical agenda, and an engineering professor saying, we got to stop that bugger. It's much more incoherent. It's much more just making the rules work. How do I survive this? How do I just not have to do any more work? It's a combination of all of those things. Now, if that's the case, that is both a silver lining and a tragedy. On the one hand, it shows that universities are far less cohesive and coherent than we imagined. But simultaneously, it makes the point that the book makes. A very astute leader, a very committed activist can make a difference. I don't think they can fundamentally decolonize an institution in a colonial society. I don't think I think Liz is right in that. But we can make a difference. We can make institutions better. We can have more thoughtful curriculum. We can have knowledge engagement systems that are across transnational boundaries. We can bring down the costs of higher education. You can establish support systems for students. And now that will not define what decolonization is in its entirety. But we can make a difference by initiating reforms that are useful. I think that's where the book lands up. And I think that the really important conversation of the decolonization debate and everything else is how do we understand the role of the individual within the institution? What are the parameters of opening up space? What are the parameters of closing up? How far can you go without somebody closing it? That's where the real nuance of the debate lies. Now, that's the first thing I wanted to say. There's a second I wanted to raise. I do think that as much as the university is as incoherent, I think the social movement is utterly incoherent. By the way, I think this debate on decolonization in part was made up as people went along. So they were I don't think people thought we were going to advance the decolonization agenda. I think a couple of people were pissed off. They were pissed off about fees. They were pissed off. They felt alienated. A lot of them got together. They got together because they thought it's coherent, that they will come together. They launched a movement. Somebody decided to throw poo on a statue. Hey, suddenly everybody got animated by that. He became quite famous, and it took on a life of its own. So this idea that we have a set of coherent actors thinking through decolonization I just don't think true. I think they were making it up. We were making it up. We all were grappling with the social phenomenon. That social phenomenon was a product of deep fissures in our society and discrimination. And it took a particular form in this context. And I think that that's also something that we need to recognize. It isn't as thoughtful, cohesive, planned, proactive. All of us were trying to find a way. And there was a whole series of scam artists. Entire would say, how can I make some cash? How can I do something? How do I benefit here? And that happens in all social struggles. And we just need to recognize all of this.
Okay. Quite a few points there. If we had time, we would have unpacked some of the stuff that you're saying there, Professor Habib. Some issues that I think will be deliciously contentious, but we will leave it there for now. Cyril, you wanted to make a comment?
There was a question about who should create the spaces where these things
alternative models.
Yeah. The issue is it's systemic. So for me, the conversation has to happen throughout the system. The problem then comes when different agents in the system have to interact, because that's where you get movement. We sat in some interviews where I listened for 2 hours and I had no idea what I was told for 2 hours, because it became very individualized and so very personalized. And so for me in the system, if we create these spaces, we have to meet each other somewhere. I need to be able to understand what you're actually saying. And that humility in sort of just talking plain English in the system, I think will get everyone along. But I think we're talking, the inertia comes when people in the system just don't know what the other one is talking about.
Just ask, Max, what are your thoughts on Liz's point, the very useful point that you can't really, do radical change unless you also, do it in the context of a conversation about an unjust society. I know you think deeply about these things and do the change anyway, such as your work in polymer chemistry. You want to say a few words on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the complexity, right? That any individual can't affect this, but no change is going to happen unless there's a both and. You need individuals who are thinking about these things and are engaging at multiple levels, but an individual working at multiple levels is not going to make the change. It requires action within the system. So I think what we need is a space where the system supports and catalyzes the work of individuals who are attempting to make such changes. And I think my experience of being within the system was that it provided me a window wherein I could do the work that I was really interested in doing, but it wasn't supporting that in any way. So it wasn't undermining that effort, which probably would have happened before the protests, but you need more than that. You need systemic support. So it's a both and for me.
I can see that we have some questions online. Okay. Okay, sure.
So I would like to know, I'm leaning on what is the responsibility of current education practitioners and leaders in this educational sector? What do you think their responsibility is in regards to discussion of decolonizing this space? What advice would you give them, and how do we actually in this space? Add on to just for people to be seen.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't catch your name? John. Okay, thank you, John. So John's question is about the responsibility of teachers and people, academics, people who are within the university. I saw there was another one from Thomas Salmon.
Yeah, so the question is, if the argument is that universities are necessarily conservative and unable to reach beyond the unequal status quo of society they serve and offer integration, how do you reconcile that with the way that decolonization debate has profoundly impacted universities around the world outside of South Africa and has proven intellectually generative outside of Africa? Does this argument simply explain why the rupture of decolonization movements in SA was in a series of turbulent, awkward, and contested?
Oh, fantastic. That is a good question. It's long. It's long, but that's a good question.
I disagree with the premise of that question completely, having looked at, in our review, at movements towards decolonization in other parts of the world. I don't think those institutions have changed at all. You think of the most radical of them in the Netherlands, the Asylum University. It was, I thought, a fantastic radical idea, but it doesn't exist anymore. Why is my curriculum so white? Adam would know at UK institutions. I don't think that led to an upheaval of anything. So I think that the premise of the question is just wrong. I think institutions are powerful things, and they have patience. They can patiently wait you out until the fever dies down, and then they continue, as Sir Ahmed says, institutional as usual.
So I'm not as optimistic about what's happening. We have talked about doing a cross-national study that looks more systematically at those issues, but I don't think. Look, I think I agree with Liz, obviously, and Adam and Robbie. You can't do an analysis of curriculum in isolation of an analysis of society, institutions, and so on and so forth. But for those of us who are academic teachers, you've got to start somewhere. To your point, okay, what then is our responsibility? And so for me, I agree with Liz. I don't think a core curriculum will fundamentally shift the institutional curriculum, but it begins to open up crevices. It begins to open the fissures. It begins to. There's a academic at Stellenbosch who I greatly admire, Elmarie Constantius, and what Elmarie has single-handedly done is to change the architecture of Stellenbosch, the visible architecture, through artistic works, through the way she teaches about the displacement of Black people from the middle of Stellenbosch, where they now are university buildings, and saying to the students, do you understand where you are? For me, that is powerfully radical. No, it's not going to change, the millionaire economy of Stellenbosch, but at least begins to develop a generation of students who can't say we didn't know, and who will themselves become leaders in business, in education, in law, and so on, who have had at least a contrary set of ideas that they have to grapple with, which they never would have otherwise. And that, I think, is the power of curriculum, okay? Even in an unjust society, it prepares leaders of the future to be able to speak to those. At an analytical level, this is, of course, correct. You have to hold those two things in conversation. But at the level of what do academic teachers do, you have to begin to introduce these powerful ideas into the curriculum, as opposed to, as Max correctly says, an examination-driven culture in which the only thing that's important to the teacher and the learners is the next examination.
Do we have any last comment, question there?
There's a line saying, are there any plans for a book from a student's perspective on what decolonization means? Because they say there's a comment from students to say that they don't go to previously white universities or Black academics. So what does decolonization mean from a student perspective, and have you done any work and why you found it?
I mean, let me just say this: we get that question a lot when you talk about academics. People say, "Why are you not talking about teachers?" It reminds me of my friend Neil Riss, is a historian, a white guy. And people say, "Why are you studying white people?" He says, "Because I'm not studying Black people." I mean, it's ridiculous. This notion that whatever angle you take, must take the other angle. Let me just say this: if you look at the collection of about 12 books on decolonization in South Africa, almost all of them are written from student perspectives. Almost all of them. We review them in the book. So it's not true that there aren't books on student perspectives. And sometimes they're curated by people like, I forget the name of this huge academic, that put together student voices. Most of the books are on student perspectives. This is the only one that is a fairly in-depth study of academic behavior, academic perspectives, and so on. So it's not true.
Okay, I think the time has come that I relinquish my power. I can understand the concept that, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I would love to keep going. I wanted to, I was tempted, but my conscience hit me at the last minute. So, colleagues, family, friends, we will end the conversation, the recorded conversation part of our discussion here. And at this moment, I would like to hand over back to Mark to round up our conversation and direct us.
Thanks so much, Precious. I don't think I can do justice by it, but I thought, the thing that came to mind when I was listening to the voices here today is that all the different voices that you do hear in an event like this, and the different voices that come out from the different actors in a moment of what might have been change, what might have been the start of change, or might have been a failed change. But also the fact those voices came here and were honest and frank and shared their experiences of maybe not knowing or not maybe have made mistakes, but also in the opportunities that were for them, the opportunities available. The voices of Cyril and Jonathan, of the authors and creators of this work, who in their own experiences in terms of finding and navigating through this experience. But also the voices, if you read the book, and I encourage you to do so, the voices of the actors on the ground, the academics and the individuals struggling with, how do I make sense of this? How do I make sense to do the right thing by my students, by my discipline, when there isn't any guidance, there isn't any official policy at that time, or official policy is actually evolving. It shows how life is messy, institutions are messy, institutions may resist change, but also there remains opportunities for change as well. So I'd like to thank our speakers first online, Max Blackie and Adam Habib. I'd like to ask our panelists that joined us today, Wabi Long and Liz Lange. I'd like to, particularly by our authors, which it's a really great privilege and honour for us to host an event like this, and thanks for choosing Stellenbosch Business School to do that, Jonathan Jansen and Cyril Walters. But also thank them for putting themselves on the line. They put themselves out, they put their ideas out there, and then they listened to friendly criticism but also plaudits, and they took both with great dignity and in a very, very nice way. But also to Precious Simba for not abusing her power, but using her power in a very benevolent way, and it was making this such a wonderful event. And finally, thanks to you in the audience in the room, you in the audience online for joining us. This is really a great event, and one we'd like to think that Stellenbosch Business School can do again in the future, to a convening space to have tricky conversations, difficult conversations, but important conversations. I'm afraid, for you online, we'll have to say goodbye, but everybody out here in the room, welcome you to join us for a glass of wine and some snacks, but also to buy the book, which I thoroughly recommend, and also to, if you're lucky, to get it signed as well. Thanks once again for joining us, and please stay with us for a little bit longer and enjoy the time.
Before you go, I've randomly put some blue stickies under 3 chairs for book giveaways, a small gift. So you literally just have to feel underneath your chair, just if the third one wasn't found, then I will do a random draw in the office. Did you find the other one? It's really just at the front of the chair.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.